Welcome to part 2 of the external display test. For this one, I'll be covering Capture One exclusively and show you when we start to scale up displays on the M1 Pro and M1 Max, when does Capture One start to slow down, and when does the experience become unusable in the program if it ever gets to that point. So let's find out together. This is Artist Right. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. I've decided to break down this test into 3 separate parts. This way you can view the test for the app that you're using in the workflow. If you have already seen part 1, I'll leave timestamp in the description below so you can jump to the overview for the testing that I'll be doing with Capture One and the demonstration I'll show you and see the result right away. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, I'll leave a link to it up here and in the description below. I highly encourage you to check that out because it talks a little bit more in depth about all the display connection and establish the baseline for the test that we are doing with a little bit more depth and discussion. Now, what I'd like to briefly go over is the test and reference system. You will see that I have 3 systems that I'm testing. One is the Base M1 processor in the 14-inch, and it has 32 gigabytes of memory. I have 2 M1 Max, one with 64 gigabytes of memory and the other one with 64 gigabytes, and those are in the 16-inch model. For all these tests, there are no fan noise whatsoever on any of these machines. Even when I link them up to 4 different displays, I mean, they perform really well. You will also find out that if you run this test on a 2019 MacBook Pro with the Intel processors, just linking it to 2 displays and running the test in the exact same way, the fan will start to run almost immediately. A quick thing about macOS and display scaling: if you run your macOS display at a different resolution, essentially your computer will scale. And the way how macOS scales is that it renders double the resolution for every single scaling point that you use. So essentially you're really rendering 4 times as much data. So if we set our display to the largest scaling possible, which is the 3360 by 1890, we're really pushing the equivalent of 25.4 megapixel to 4 displays link up the system at any one time. So it is absolutely crazy. So I'll be doing a test in 4K native and also with the highest scale resolution and see if things slow down or not. And quickly, I want to go over displays that I use in a test video. All of them are 4K display. One of them is the BenQ SL55, which is their digital signage line. It is the world first Pantone validated display. BenQ PD3220U, that's part of their Pro Designer series that has Thunderbolt connection. BenQ SW271C and SW271, which are hardware calibrated display for photographers. And as I mentioned, all of them are 4K display using various type of connection. For our testing method, I am going a little crazy here. This is not a true reflection of a real world scenario, but I wanted to see with these type of moderate workload, when does the computer and the app start to slow down? So I have both Safari and Chrome running. Each of these programs will have 2 windows, and for each of those windows, they will have an active YouTube video, my channel running, and also in the background, there are 3 tabs. So with 2 of these windows running, each of these browsers will have 8 tabs total. And when you combine these 2 together, you're looking at 16 tabs. For this test, we are going to look at Capture One, and you will see some of the editing, localized adjustment on a 36 megapixel Nikon D810 to see if there is any slowdown when we edit on a single display and dual display, and when we have other displays linked up to the system. And the next test will be on a 120 megapixel panorama file. This is a test template. If you'd like to see an established baseline, I definitely recommend checking out the first test video, which walks you through kind of like the baseline test that I'm doing. But for Capture One, these are the tests that I will be showing you. And there are some slowdown here and there, but I think that overall the usability of it is rather good, especially when you just really think about getting a 32 gigabyte, 32 GPU M1 Max machine. That is pretty much like the M1 Max that you can just go out and configure from Apple. They have a pre-configure run there. It runs fairly well, and going up to 64, I mean, it does improve the performance a little bit, but not that much at all when you really jump to 64 gigabytes. So let's have a look. Base 14-inch MacBook Pro, 2 external 4K display at scale resolution, and this is going to be a dual screen edit. So all the Chrome and Safari tab and the video playing in the background has been aggregated to one screen. So 2 of these windows are Chrome, 2 are Safari. And what I have is Lightroom, Capture One, and along with Final Cut Pro running in dual screen mode. Let's see what happens. Starting with, again, the Aurora 36 megapixel. We'll go in to do the adjustment. we can see that it takes much longer to preview and do the render on the external display. I'm going to start dialing things up and down like crazy here, and we'll see what happens. So the behavior is similar to what we see in Lightroom, where the internal display gets updated first and the external display signal does take a little bit longer for it to get there, for it to render all those. It's not the worst experience, but it's not necessarily the smoothest. Let's go in, add some gradient in the sky. So we can see as redarkening, it does work, but there is some delay and some lag because the program does take a little bit longer to render. Now let's have a look at panorama file, 120 megapixel. So we can definitely see that it does slightly struggle a little bit, although overall I would say it's really not too bad considering we're using a really large file. Let's do one more gradient in the sky area. Darken this down. So it does take a moment for it to render. I wouldn't say this is a bad experience at all, especially if you're pushing your display this hard, but it definitely is something to be aware of. Picking up where the 14-inch MacBook Pro with the base M1 Pro processor and 32 gigabytes of RAM is starting to show a slowdown is when we have two external 4K display link up to the system and we run this at scale resolution. I have a 16-inch MacBook Pro. This is the one with the M1 Max processor, 32-core GPU, 32 gigabytes of memory, and right now we're connecting this to two external displays, 4K running at scale resolution. Let's see if this computer can handle that much better and to see if there are any slowdowns when we're trying to do this. Let's jump into Capture One. We'll do the adjustment and let's see how fast the rendering is on the external display. So far, it does take a few seconds for me to dial these things in, or the settings, and it reflects on the external display. I would say that this is a touch slow, but it's not that bad at all. It's never an instantaneous experience, even when I was using an Intel one, so I think this is okay. Let's do a gradient in the sky. And let's now darken this. We can see that this machine is definitely struggling to really follow through on that quite a little bit there. Once it has, I can go in and make the adjustment fairly quickly, fairly rapidly, but there was a slight slowdown. Let's look at the pano again, 120 megapixel. This is taking a moment for it to load and generate the full preview. We'll go in and do massive adjustment to this file right away. So once the preview is done, you can see as I'm dialing this thing up and down, for example, the exposure, it's catching up fairly quickly, which is a good thing. Let's try the gradient on the sky. And so far, I think that once the program has a chance to catch up, it's actually not too bad at all. You can see as I'm dialing these up and down on this 120 megapixel file, it's still fairly responsive. So I think that even if you run this at the scale resolution, you're going to be okay. 16-inch M1 Max, 32 GPU, 32 gigabytes of memory, 4 4K displays running at 4K native. We still have the 4 videos running, and also this will be a dual screen edit. Let's look at Capture One. So we're seeing that as I am dialing these changes in, the external display is catching up fairly quickly, and this is considering there are a lot of GPU tasks being used to render all these other videos. Let's do a gradient. So far, gradient's pretty responsive. 120 megapixel file. Let's start pushing this. So far in Capture One, experience is actually not bad at all. 16-inch M1 Max, 32 GPU, 32 gigabytes of memory, 4K displays, all running at scale resolution, and this is a dual screen edit. So we'll start out with, again, the Aurora Borealis photo. We can see right now that as I'm dialing everything in, it does take a significant moment for Capture One to really render the previews on the external display. Let's do a gradient and darken the sky. So as I'm dialing this down, this doesn't happen quite as quick as it was before, but this is really loading the display system. 120 megapixel file, ready loading, and it is still doing the full rendering, but I am going to dial everything in right now. Let's see how long it takes for it to really catch up with what we're doing. So not too long, and this is really not too bad. However, as I'm dialing this up and down, you can see that the changes are not really reflecting on the external display quite as fast as it was before. Let's try a gradient. And as I'm dialing this up and down, there is a hesitation, and it does take some time for it to preview on the external display. So, not too bad. The program hasn't freeze up or anything like that, which is a great thing to see. 16-inch M1 Max, 32 GPU, 64 gigabytes of memory, link up to 4 external 4K displays, all running at scale resolution. Let's have a look at Capture One. So far, the thumbnail is rendering much faster on the primary display than on the external one. It's not quite bad, and as we dial things up and down, it does take a quick moment for it to make the update and the adjustment necessary. So there is some slight slowdown there. Let's do a gradient. We'll darken and brighten the sky. It does happen fairly quick, it's not too bad. Overall, this is a really usable experience. No matter how you look at it, there may be some slight slowdown, but it's actually not too bad at all. Because this is a new setup, it needs to load and render the preview. Let's make all the changes. You can see that even on this 120 megapixel pano, it's catching up fairly well with it. Let's again darken the sky. And on this one, the changes happening to the sky is fairly responsive. So overall, Capture One experience, not bad at all, especially when you have multiple displays link up to a system and you max everything all out. Now that you have seen Capture One performance shown in a few sample scenarios, I think one of them that I wanted to really point out is the 4 external displays running at 4K native dual screen edit. The reason why I'm including this is to show you that if you're using a 4K display and if you're just running them at native, the program does a really good job catching up with the external display rendering or preview. It may take a little bit longer. However, That is to be expected considering we're loading the GPU in the system that much and also the CPU at the same time. So the performance is really quite good. I think when we start to see a problem on the Macintosh system in general, especially when we start to link things to multiple display, is when we start to scale them and running dual screen edit, as you saw in the last two samples that I've shown. A lot of lag happening, and that is because your computer GPU is being pushed to the brink. Rather than just pushing out 8.3 megapixels 60 times per second to each of these displays, it's now literally computing almost 3 times as much per each displays per second. I mean, that's kind of crazy if you really think about that. And considering that it can still perform fairly well, there's no lockup, there's no spinning beach ball, I mean, that's really not bad. And I think the Achilles heels for all these systems is that when you start to scale the resolution on all the external 4K displays and really push the system hard by having multiple videos playing, for example, 4 videos like we have, you start to see a slowdown. I think that if you're just running Capture One as a singular program, you're going to be fine even when you do it scale resolution. And I would say that if you're running 4K display, for example, a 32 or a 27-inch display, having scaled is probably going to be more important if you're in the studio. However, if you have like a big 42, 55-inch display, you may not need to scale that at all. You'll be a little bit further away, but you'll be able to read that just fine without any eye strain. So ultimately, this will depend on your workflow, but now you have a pretty good idea when things start to slow down and how much we push it. In a real-world scenario, I think you're going to be just fine with the 32GB model and not having too much problem. This is also going to be better too once Capture One is optimized to run on the M1 Pro and M1 Max processor in a future release version. This is going to be the test that I'll be doing for Lightroom Classic, which will be released right after this video. So make sure you stay tuned, subscribe, and hit on the notification bell for that. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below, give this a like, and remember, in art we trust. And here's the bonus footage with the 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro. The test is done in the exact same way as the M1 Pro, M1 Max. This is the top machine, which is 2.8 gigahertz, 8-core i9 processor, 32 gigabytes of memory just dedicated to the CPU alone. It has an integrated graphic, but right now, because we're pushing this so hard, it is using the Radeon Pro 5500M with 8 gigabytes of memory just dedicated to the GPU. I have Lightroom Classic, Capture One, Final Cut Pro running along with 2 browsers as we have done in all the other tests. So Chrome and Safari actively playing videos, and it also has tabs in the background. In addition, both of these displays are 4K, but they're running at scale resolution at 3360 by 1890. So they are pushing around 25.4 megapixels 60 times per second to each of these displays. Let's have a look at how Capture One performs on this machine. Dual screen edit right now. I will go in and start to dial these changes in. You can see that this takes a much longer time for the preview to happen on the external display. And the sliders that I'm pushing up and down right now, they're not that smooth at all. There is a lot of lag, and that hasn't really published the result on the external one yet. There we go. So there is a clear lag. Let's see if we put a gradient on here. How would that work? Right. So gradient's going. And I'll dial this down. Again, it is taking a very long time to make an adjustment. This is the part where your experience would definitely get hindered by the performance of the machine in general. So it definitely does show some lag. Let's have a look at the 120 megapixel panorama. And this is again loading on the system. All right. Now that it has loaded, let's see what happens when we start to dial the contrast and everything up and down. I think that this is a touch smoother, although I wouldn't describe it as best by any means. And normally, yes, I would adjust the picture much better than I'm doing now, but I'm just really trying to see how fast this would respond. So let's do a gradient one more time. And as I've darkened the gradient of the sky, you can see takes a moment to respond to this, where on the base 14-inch M1 Pro and on the 16-inch with the M1 Max, the performance is much quicker than what you're seeing now.